I'm going to ask my friend Brian Lawrence, who grew up with somebody who's a director at Berkshire Hathaway, and I thought that he would be the best person to introduce him to the group. He's got to stay for a very short time and then leave. He's got a lot of things to do. I'm very, very grateful, Chris, that you're here. But now I'm going to give you Brian to introduce his friend Chris.
Great, thank you, Guy. And boy, thanks again to the Aquamarine team for putting this on. It's just such a blessing to have this this get together. So thank you everyone for doing this. Okay, Chris Davis. I've known Chris Davis my entire life, so there's a lot I could tell you, but I'll just limit it to this. To have Chris Davis as your friend is to have a life that's much more filled with laughter and learning, which is a good thing. And he's achieved worldly success as an investor, which is great. Those are great things. But the most remarkable thing that I want to talk to you about him, introducing him, is his trustworthiness. And it's interesting, Buffett often talks to students and he says, look around the room at the other students and think about who is it who you have the most confidence in, who's going to do a good job through their life. Who do you want to buy 10% of their current earnings at cost and ride them up? And what are those qualities? And one of those qualities is within your control. He always talks about trustworthiness. And I would just like to call out Chris Davis for that. Chris's trustworthiness is the kind that leads you to ask him to be a trustee for your children if something happens to you or the mother of your children. And it's the kind of trustworthiness that led Warren to ask him to be a director of Berkshire Hathaway. And just think about what that means as the last of these two geniuses nears the end of his mortal life. What happens to the culture of Berkshire Hathaway? If you're Warren, who do you trust with taking on the burden of making sure that that culture goes on? And how do you persuade someone to do it for $6,700 a year? So I'd just like to thank Chris for that and ask him to come talk to us.
I'm not even sure I'm going to use these slides. I put together a few. Well, we'll give it a try. I just push this button if I'll use this if I want. All right. Well, I first of all, you know, Guy has built a web of deserved trust, and I think that is one of the reasons many people are here. I told Brian that his thoughts about trust brought to mind something I've been noodling on, and I don't have any way to prove it yet. But you know, you think of this idea of living in a web of deserved trust, right? What Charlie said we should all aspire to, and I was trying to quantify what that might mean. How can you quantify the value of trust in an organization? Because obviously Berkshire is a tremendously trust-based organization. Deals are made on a handshake based on character. There's not reams of due diligence and consultants and forensic accountants and private investigators doing background checks and so on. So it's a trust-based system. How could you quantify it? And I think the most interesting way is to think about crypto. And what I mean by that is a phrase that you often hear people who are involved in the crypto space talk about is that it's a trustless network. In other words, you do not have to know anything about the character of the person on the other side of that transaction. You don't have to know if they're a crook, or you don't have to know anything about them. And there's nobody in the middle. Usually a deal with somebody, there's an intermediary, a bank or somebody stands in the middle. So they tout the virtue of a trustless network. But what's interesting to think about is therefore the mechanism of the crypto blockchain is designed to synthetically create trust, right? It's artificial trust. So an interesting thought experiment is just to think about how much energy needs to be consumed by the blockchain to synthesize trust, right? It's a sort of an interesting idea because that's what it's doing. It's a way to quantify, to have that transaction happen without trust. We need to burn a lot of carbon. We need to use a lot of compute power, a lot of electricity to synthetically create trust. And the sort of trust that can be done with a phone call to somebody that you've done business with for 25 years, and you can do $1 billion or $2 billion or $10 billion transaction on that phone call and on that handshake with no carbon. So anyway, that's a totally aside that I hadn't thought about saying that, but it's something I've been noodling. This is what I thought about saying, but I don't have my reading glasses, so I'm not sure I can help you with that either. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to just power through a very short number of slides just to sort of stir the pot, and then I'll just take questions until Guy gives me the hook. And I guess this is a useful first slide, which is why, it's just the purchasing power of $1 since 2000. So when you think about risk and risk-free rates and, the idea of, preservation of principal, you've lost almost half your money since 2000 and you still have $1. I think that's a useful thing. Components, when you do decide to be in the investment game that create your return, are this combination of the results and then the behavior, right? So a business will generate a certain return, but your behavior and when you purchase or when you decide to sell that business will be an equal determinant. You can quantify it. This simply looks at dollar-weighted returns of funds versus time-weighted returns. So you can see about 170 basis points per year of behavior penalty, right? And that doesn't get broken out, but that's just simply a fund has great results for 5 or 6 years and people pile in and then it has crappy results and people get out. The 10-year returns may be fine, but the return that the actual investors got was much lower because of the investor behavior side. So I thought I'd just give a quick sort of defense against the dark arts of things that are just a couple of things that I think really influence those behaviors. And I think one of them is really thinking about forecasts. A lot of time will be spent in the next 2 days with people giving market forecasts and recession forecasts. And this was the market forecast for 2024. I named names. I actually put the strategists. The green bar is what happened, and the blue bars were all of the forecasts of all of the top strategists on Wall Street. And it's amazing that those strategists have a real impact on behavior, right? If you're forecasting 4,200, your clients behave in a certain way, and if you're forecasting 5,200, they behave in a different way, and there was no predictive value. There'll be a lot of talk about interest rates and the Fed and what's going to happen. Bill Miller and I started this almost 25 years ago. The Wall Street Journal puts a 6-month forecast for interest rates, the top strategists on Wall Street, survey of economists, and it had 0 predictive value, right? Which is sort of amazing. The idea that those forecasts influence behavior with absolutely no predictive value. Okay, this is where I really get dirty. This is because I have hedge fund envy. Some of you may manage hedge funds. You should know as a fair warning that I'm deeply jealous of your fees. But I do think it's by and large a racket. I think you're more paid for volatility. If I own a stock and it goes up 15% a year for 4 years and then falls in half, my clients have broken even and your clients have lost 25 or 30% because they paid you that 20% each year on the way up. So I don't love that alignment. But this is a really interesting real world study. This just looks at the total hedge fund index over this is a 10-year period. And you can see the dramatic underperformance. But what's really dramatic is the beige bar in the middle are just hedge funds whose business model is to make investments based on macroeconomic predictions. And so that is sort of an amazing real world case. Well, of course, that raises the wonderful question that I put to Charlie years ago when Dorothy, as always, arranged a dinner or time for us to get together. And I said, Charlie, I'm a believer in capitalism. I'm a believer in free markets. How the hell can it be the case that a free market system, which is supposed to promote efficiency, could allow all of these strategists and economists and hedge fund people to make a living? And of course, he told the iconic story of the fishing tackle shop in Minnesota where he went to buy a lure and there was this new pink and green one. And he said, my God, do fish take this? And the guy said, mister, I don't sell to fish. Right? So when you think about the Weather Channel is not in the business of predicting the weather, right? That's not their business. Their business is selling ads. To sell ads, they need engagement. To have engagement, the best way to get engagement is fear, right? So you can't just have a snowstorm. You have snowpocalypse, and you have a storm of the century 2 or 3 times a year. You have these new phrases, heat dome, polar vortex. Well, that's because they're not predicting the weather. They're selling ads. And of course, those economists are giving predictions because they're asked, not because they know. A little word just on today's market and sort of what happened in the last couple of years, which was just the growth assumptions that went into valuing a lot of businesses. And I just wanted to give you a quick look at how hard those growth assumptions are to actually create in the real world. And when you do a DCF on a company and you're modeling 20% sales growth for a decade, it's possible, but it's not the way you'd bet. 3% of companies have achieved that, and lots of times by the time you're looking at that company, they've already done it for 8 or 10 years. Margins even more. It's amazing how many models I saw in the last few years that still assumed EBIT margins over 50%, and you can see how quickly those margins diminish, even on the handful of companies that have been able to do it. All right, I'm going to kind of end with a quote that is very central to my way of thinking in these days especially. This is a quote by my grandfather. Said, "You always sound smarter if you're bearish." And yet, here's what's really been happening in the real world. Over very long periods of time, almost all terrible things have been declining. Right? You can look at hunger, children dying, child labor, ozone, smoke particles, nuclear arms, smallpox. Good things have been increasing. You look at harvest, water, immunization, girls in school, women's right to vote. So it's easy to adopt a cynical mindset. I'm going to end with in addition to the wisdom of Charlie Munger and to reference Guy's Seneca quote. Remember, Seneca also said, "Great is the man who can make you better in his presence, but greater still the one that can make you better just holding him in your thoughts." And of course, Charlie's famous, wonderful talk about the paths to misery highlighted the big 3, quoting Johnny Carson: addiction, envy, and resentment. And I'm going to add a 4th that was not on Charlie's list, even in his extended list, which is cynicism. And it creeps into cultures, it creeps into investors. And skepticism is a useful trait for an investor. You ask, show me. But cynicism is sort of a why bother. You sound smart if you're bearish. You point out all the ways the strong man may have stumbled. And so I think adding cynicism to the list of ways to lead a miserable life is a useful one. And I'll just show, this happens to be our fund, but just look at all the terrible things that are listed on there. Chernobyl and oil shocks and 3 Mile Islands, stagflation, the 70s, and so on. There's, being bearish makes you sound smart, but I think ultimately cynicism's a lousy way to live and not a great way to get wealthy. So with that, I'll stop.
So I have one question that, and then we're going to take, I don't know how much time we have, like 2 or 3, and then it's really so grateful to you that you came here. You only got 1,000 meetings to go to, but so one of the things you said there is addiction to mind-altering substances, and I'm blown away by how many people. I had a guy in my office who told me, and he's a serious guy, he's a risk manager at a bank, and he said, I microdosed on LSD today. And I'm told stories that many of the people in the White House are microdosing. What do you say to people? You must come into contact with them who do that.
I think that, microdosing very quickly becomes dosing. The idea that hallucinogenics can play a part in curing certain types of mental illness or therapeutic breakthroughs, I think that is almost obviously true in the right circumstances. But the sort of data that's come out about alcohol has led people to think that other things are much safer, and I think it's a disaster. If somebody wakes up and has a shot of whiskey, even that person knows he's got a problem, right? And the civilization knows. But to get up and vape on your way to work is just common practice. It's just wake and bake. And now, similarly, this sort of microdosing, just this idea of I'm casually rewiring my brain, I think it's a very dangerous phenomenon.
So, audience, a couple of questions before we say goodbye to Chris. be quick because, yes, go ahead.
Hi, this is a wonderful opportunity to ask you a question. My name is Adam Mead. I'm from Derry, New Hampshire. Question on Berkshire's governance at the subsidiary level. So Warren has kind of hinted at this over time where Tony Nicely stepped down as CEO and he's chairman of Geico, and Todd and Ted were chair of some of the subsidiaries, but we don't really hear too much about it from Warren. So maybe any insight into boards of directors, governance at that subsidiary level would be wonderful. Thank you.
Well, what I'd say is, and I am on the audit committee, is, I talked about a trust-based system, and you have to be compliant with internal audit standards and so on. So there's rigor there, but there is a recognition that if you were to choose two evils, the evil of using governance and audit as an excuse to change and bury the identity of the subsidiary, in our view, given the financial strength of Berkshire, that is more of a risk than the risk of a little fraud happening once in a great while. And, I spoke at the CFO's meeting of all the CFOs of the Berkshire subs, and you go to a meeting, room like this, everybody's got a name tag, and none of those name tags say Berkshire, right? They say Acme, they say Justin. That's part of the culture, the enormous pride and identity with the company that they work for and that they've built or are part of. And in a way, the control systems in those companies are the safeguard. That's the moat that keeps headquarters from leaping in and swamping them by saying, we need to tie up our accounting systems and you need to do this implementation of this process or procedure. So I think it is a light touch. It's a thoughtful touch, and there is a trust but verify mindset. But I think the bigger mindset is to really recognize that trust is the superpower. And we could throw in teams of internal auditors, and they could go in and scrub, and all we would do is crush that sense of identity that has been the big part of what's built the companies. And if you look at the fraud over history, it's so tiny in comparison relative to the benefit that comes from that entrepreneurialism persisting.
So there are boards, maybe advisory, more of an advisory type of.
Yeah, it depends on the businesses, and the results all are rolled up every month, and and there's cash. It's very, it's a cash culture, but yeah, there's not separate board meetings unless it serves that company.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. And we're going to make this the last question so that Chris can get on his way. I think that there's a lot of curiosity about how the machinery actually works on the inside. So I really appreciate Adam's question.
If you find out, let me know.
Hi, Chris. Thank you, Guy, for doing this. Chris, wonderful presentation. I'm also a fund manager. My name is Bhuvan Gupta, and I think the fee structure is a never-ending question. So what should be the basis of the fee structure for any fund manager to decide? My friend met Pat Dorsey yesterday. He charges $220. So a lot of people have different fee structures. What should be the basis to a right fee structure?
Well, you should probably charge as much as you can get, right? That's the mindset. I charge $220 because I can't get $330. I don't think there's anything so terrible about offering your customers a bargain, right? That's what sort of built Costco. It creates a relationship. Of course, it makes achieving outperformance easier if you have a lower fee burden. I think it's hard not to have a cost of capital if you have an incentive fee structure. You shouldn't get, what do they say in the biz? Paid for the beta? I don't know. But I do think that the asymmetry can be problematic. But of course, Warren and Charlie both ran funds that had an incentive fee structure. I think Lou Simpson was paid on an incentive fee structure. So, Bill Miller did something very curious on his fund, which is he offered all of his customers a choice. They could have a flat fee of 1%. They could have 0 fixed fee and 20% of the profits, or they could have 50% of the outperformance of the index, of the S&P 500. And they could choose. His largest investor, who happened to be the CEO of a big tech company, his office chose the zero cost alpha. That's what they called the 50% of the outperformance. And in that year, Bill was up 130%. And this man had to pay something like 60% of the starting $100 million account as a fee. So anyway, I think offering the choice may be a way to go. I've never seen anybody else do it, but.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks.
I'm going to get Brian, thank you, since he introduced you.
In business school, this is called a cold call. You don't really know that it's coming, but it's actually not that hard to thank Chris, who's one of my oldest and best friends. I'm actually up here with two of my oldest and best friends. It's sort of a blessing to be here with them. But to make time on a day like today when you're in the middle of all of this stuff is really terrific. So thank you very much.